Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Carta de Vineri, the Book of Friday Club. We're this evening with Professor Dennis Deletant. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. My colleague Andra and Nicola and some guests. Thank you very much all for joining us. And we're going to go on a journey, in search of Romania, I think. Something that probably every one of us has done for the past week, given the context. But we'll come back to that. So, Nicola, without further ado, I'll let you introduce us.
Thank you, Serena. My name's Nicola. I'm an art and cultural historian, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Dennis Deletant with a very impressive biography. Dennis Deletant is a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He is a visiting Ionratu Professor of Romanian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Sorry, he served as visiting Ionratu Professor of Romanian Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. from August 2011 to July 2020. He is Emeritus Professor of Romanian Studies at University College London, where he taught in the School of Slavonic and East European Studies between 1969 and 2011, and was Professor of Romanian Studies at the University of Amsterdam on secondment from UCL between 2003 and 2010. Dennis was appointed to the board of the British government's Know-How Fund for Central and Eastern Europe in 1990 and was actively involved in its work in Romania and in the Republic of Moldova until 1999, when the board was disbanded. The establishment of the fund was influenced by the desire of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher that Britain should play a leading role in helping the nations of the former Soviet bloc to make the transition from communism to democracy through the transfer of expertise, economic and political. For his work on the fund, Dennis was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1995. Dennis was awarded Ordinal Pentru Merit, Order of Merit, with the rank of Commander of Services to Romanian Democracy on the 1st of December 2000 by President Emil Constantinescu of Romania, and the Star of Romania, Romania's highest civilian honor, by President Klaus Iohannis on 26th of October 2016 for his activity in the promotion of Romanian history, language and culture. Dennis is the author of several monographs and volumes of studies on the recent history of Romania, among them Ceausescu and the Securitate, Coercion and Dissent in Romania, 1965 to 89, Communist Terror in Romania, Georgiu Dej, apologies for my pronunciation, and the Police State, 1948 to 65, Hitler's Forgotten Ally, Ion Antonescu and his regime, Romania, 1940 to 44, British clandestine activities in Romania during the Second World War, and Romania under Communism, Paradox and Degeneration. An autobiographical memoir, and the book we will be discussing this evening, In Search of Romania, was published by Hearst in 2022, and his most recent study, Romania 1916 to 1941, was published by Routledge in 2023. All of Dennis's books have been translated into Romanian. And just a very brief introduction to In Search of Romania before I hand over to Dennis. In Search of Romania, the book we'll be discussing this evening, is a vivid memoir which charts Dennis's first-hand experience of communist Romania, his contacts with dissidents, and his articles and BBC World Service broadcasts, which led to his being declared persona non grata in 1988. 1988. It considers questions including what was life like and how did individual citizens negotiate the challenges placed in their path, how important was the political police in maintaining compliance, how did dissent towards the regime manifest, how did all this affect the moral compass of the individual, and why did utopia descend into dystopia under Ceausescu, and how has his legacy influenced the difficult transition to democracy since the collapse of communism? Over to you, Dennis. Thank you very much.
Thank you for, first of all, for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I will say a few words about how I came to write the book, and then just guide you through the chapters of the book, and then following that, I can answer any questions that you wish to put. So the reason I wrote the book actually was because I was constantly being asked by, first of all, my students and then by members of my family to write down many of the events which I had participated in Romania, and especially to talk about certain figures from the well, at the time, from the current literary scene in Romania, cultural scene. And both my students used to interrupt my classes because they liked me to go off into these anecdotes, especially about some of the political figures that I had met down the years and the dissidents as well. So eventually, after I retired from Georgetown in 2000, I sat down and wrote some of these memories of mine, some of the accounts that I kept notes about, but in the communist period, I was rather loath to keep a diary because you were very aware, being a foreigner, that you were not monitored, and also I was worried, of course, about recording people's names. So I kept in my head, of course, the contents of discussions that I had, and then I once I got back to the UK, I wrote some notes down about them, but it wasn't in a structured way. I wasn't intending to write a book. As I say, it was really at the insistence of students and some members of my family, I think, who got tired of some of the anecdotes I told because I sometimes forgot that I'd already spoken about various events before, that I decided I better get them off my back and write some things down. So how the book is structured is really the first part of an autobiographical book, as Nicola has said. It talks about the history of my visits to Romania, who I met, what I did, what I saw. And then the second part of the book really is about figures I met, cultural figures whom I met in Romania in the communist period, who'd largely been, I felt, not given the recognition that they deserve, first of all, in Romania, and secondly, they weren't very well known outside Romania, even though several of these figures were highly courageous figures. And I have to say that many of them, most of them, were in fact women. One of the things that struck me in my history of contacts with Romania was how the women that I met were so audacious, how they were so willing to challenge the regime, whereas the men were very compliant. And I found this rather, it turned on one's head, well, it turned on the head the idea that in some way women were very subservient. I mean, in official postures that, or most of the countries, at any rate, of Southeastern Europe, adopt women are still very much second-class citizens. But my experience of helping them out, working with them, showed me that they were far more valuable, I felt, to Romanian society and to the maintenance of the dignity of Romanians in general than the memoir. In Moldova, when I was working in the Moldovan Republic in the early 90s, I came across so many instances of men being intoxicated, especially on a Sunday. And in the elections, maybe we will talk about elections later on, but during the elections, all the electoral committees in the 90s, or most of them, the ones that I was asked to attend for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, most of them were chaired by women and school teachers. And when I asked on several occasions, well, where are the men? The ladies there sort of smiled and said, well, they're sleeping off their Saturday evening consumption of alcohol. So it gives you an idea of the way in which looking at the societies, not just of Romania, but many other countries as well, you have to bear in mind they are hands-on societies, that they are not very keen on recording events. And this explains why, as historians, we have sometimes difficulty in reconstructing the past, because the regimes, the empires that many citizens, including those in Romania, lived under, were very repressive empires, and they used, of course, any documents that they could get. They used them as evidence against individual citizens. So people were very loath to record, to write. They would talk, but again, in this Aesopic language, in the hope that people wouldn't be able to fully understand what they were talking about. But this is an element of this is a cultural element that you need to bear in mind when you're dealing with Russia, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. Less so with the Central European countries, where there was more of a tradition of, let's say, following the law. And again, the whole question of the relationship of the citizen to the law is very important when you're dealing with East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, because for many citizens down their history, the law was something to avoid because it was so intrusive. And therefore, people were very, we might say, they dissimulated when they had to deal with the authorities, where, of course, mostly in the West, people recognize that the law is a very important and positive, has a very important and positive function. But this isn't the same, or wasn't the same, in Romania, for example, where people are still very suspicious of authority because of that legacy of the past. The authority was used, and the police especially were used in order to enforce the authority either of an emperor, a king, or of a single party. Not of a multi-party state, but a single party. And once again, when we're looking at the way in which people react in these countries, that is something you have to bear in mind. Coupled with that particular fact is the way in which, especially under communism, the past was manipulated, it was distorted. And so today, in connection with Romania, there are many young people, and I've just got back from Romania and I gave a number of lectures, but many young people who don't know what the fascist Iron Guard was. And so they asked me to explain. But this is, again, partly the result of the communists, for understandable reasons, partly not wishing in the school curriculum material to appear about fascist parties in the 1930s. But at the same time, if you completely erase from the past fascism, and then, of course, your audience is unaware of the problems, the violence, particularly fascist parties in Romania used against Jews and in many cases against Gypsies or Roma. So once again, partly my aim in the book was for the British and American readers to understand the cultural background which I was writing about or against, but with the aim of also ultimately having the book translated into Romanian so that the Romanian audience could understand why an English-speaking or Anglophone audience had difficulty sometimes in understanding what was going on, not just in Romania, but in the other countries of Eastern Europe, including Russia. So again, in the book, I start off with my first visit to Romania, which was in 1965, when I was a student on a summer school. I was part of a group of 10 British students who were sent by the British Council to attend a summer school on Romanian language and culture, organized by the University of Bucharest. And we stayed in a town in the mountains called Sinaia, which is about 100 miles north of Bucharest. And we spent a month there, a very useful month for those of us who were really interested in learning more about Romania's past and its culture, but also a very frustrating month because we were not really allowed freely to mix with Romanians in 1965. We always we always had a guide to keep an eye on us, and the guide was, in my case, he was very friendly towards me because I did actually speak some Romanian in 1965. So I think he was willing to try and help me understand a little bit more about the country. But for those people who didn't have a knowledge of a language, and some of my British colleagues, it was a frustrating time because they couldn't really understand what the restrictions on life were in Romania and the degree to which the Communist Party of the time, as I say, intervened or intruded or created boundaries for their existence. And still today in Romania, when I talk about my early visits to Romania, Romanian students I speak to in Romania find it very difficult to believe that Romanians couldn't travel freely. Only certain Romanians could travel in the communist period. They find it very difficult when I show them photographs of the huge queues there were in Romania in the 1980s for basic foodstuffs. They find it difficult, as I say, to believe that food was rationed. And Romania, as you well know, is a major agricultural producer. But in the late communist period, food was rationed there. Heating, even though Romania is the largest producer of petrochemicals or was, and producer of oil in Eastern Europe outside the Soviet Union, but heating oil was rationed. Gas supplies were rationed. So in the 1980s, Ceausescu's desire to pay off Romania's external debt led to these draconian austerity measures, which affected most citizens of Romania. I say most because figures in the leading figures in the Communist Party had their own shops, and they had privileged access to goods which were not available publicly in Romania. Those are some of the aspects of life in Romania which I witnessed and which I describe in the book. I go on in the book to record some of my meetings with young people, and there were many of them, people of my generation back in the 60s and 70s, and the fact that they were very interested in Western rock music. And what is a very interesting feature, I think, of the influence of the West, and especially in one of the UK on Eastern Europe, is the influence of British and American rock groups. Everywhere I went in Romania in 65 first, and then in 67 when I went back again as a student, people asked me for records or tapes of American or British rock bands. And of course, one of the reasons for that, not just because of the nature of the music, was because it was in English and they wanted to improve their knowledge of English. And so very often you can imagine trying to translate the words of Rolling Stones or the Grateful Dead or somewhere into Romanian slang, which I couldn't do, but I tried to do. Eventually in the book get to the year 1988, which was my last visit to Romania, because after then I was declared persona non grata. But during that visit in October 88, with the help of Romanian friends, I traveled around the country and I could see the effects of the austerity program on the population. For example, I went up, I was taken up to the north of the country, Baia Mare, in the county of Maramureș, and my friend, who was a professor at the University of Cluj, drove me around. And on the way back from Baia Mare to Cluj, this was on a Friday evening, we saw a lady standing by the roadside, as I say, autumn 1988, with 2 plastic bags full of bread, and she was waving traffic down and no one was picking her up. So my friend asked me if it was okay if we picked her up, because he was worried, as I was a foreigner in the car, of being stopped. If should he be stopped by the police, what was he doing ferrying a British citizen around the north of the country. So, but I said to him, well, now, of course, let's take her, poor woman. We don't know how long she's been waiting. And so we took her in the car, and to get to the next village down towards Cluj, it was a ride of 10 kilometers. And the lady was carrying bread for her parents who lived in the village 10 kilometers down south. And she explained to us that she was taking bread to her parents in a village, and in exchange, she received eggs from her parents. So the barter was an extremely important feature of life of acquiring food in Romania. And so she took every Friday a week's supply of bread for our parents. And so we drove her to the village, left her there, and then we went on. And as we were going on, there was a policeman with his black briefcase under his arm who waved us down. And of course, my friend became extremely concerned because he thought the policeman was going to check on who was in the car with him. But in fact, we stopped. Well, of course, we had to because the policeman asked us to stop. And then he got in, and I moved to the back seat. And my friend said, "Don't utter a word, Dennis. Just leave me to conduct the conversation." And before we or my friend could ask the policeman, he began a string of expletives. He began condemning Ceausescu, which of course worried my friend even more because I was a foreigner there sitting in the back. And he was saying that Ceausescu was a disaster. Look at the state of things in Romania economically. And then he said, the reason I flagged you down is I've been asked to investigate a robbery in a village down the road, and I don't have petrol for my police car. The police had no petrol for their cars in some districts. And so we took him to the village, we offloaded him, he thanked us very much, and we carried on our way. But again, it gives you an idea of the degree to which austerity affected people's lives and affected the life even of someone like a policeman who was an instrument of the country's or the parties, the Communist Party's authority. So after 1988, when I got back to London, I wrote an article under the byline of a special correspondence in the Times, which was published about my experiences in Romania and included the encounter with the lady from Baia Mare. And that's why I imagine I was declared persona non grata, because, of course, thousands of people read the Times. As a result of that, apart from having been asked really from 1986 to broadcast on the BBC World Service about Romania, and I spoke in English there because it has a huge audience. If you think about it, one of the directors of the BBC who sat in on one of my broadcasts, because as things were becoming tighter in Romania, so I was asked more frequently to appear on World Service, but the BBC in their turn were concerned that it was me all the time, and they couldn't find other people to talk about Romania who'd been to the country as often as I had. And the director was worried that in a way I was monopolizing the information that I was being asked to provide when I was interviewed on, or gay broadcaster was interviewed on the World Service. But as a result of that, in April 1989, so I was banned from going to Romania. But in April 1989, John Simpson, who was the chief correspondent, or one of the chief correspondents for BBC television, phoned me up and asked me to go and help him down at the BBC headquarters down in Wood Green in those days it was, and to translate materials filming that he and a team from the BBC had carried out in Romania in April 89, which the Securitate had wiped because John was arrested together with the crew and held in Cluj for 24 hours, and the Securitate thought they had wiped the video, but what the Securitate didn't know was the BBC even then could reconstitute wiped video. So John asked me to go down and translate the interviews, and they were with people in queues, mostly in towns in Transylvania, and it appeared as part of a panorama program on the BBC in May 1988. The revolution breaks out in Romania in December, and John rings me up, and of course he knows I can't go back to Romania because I'm still under a ban, but he asked me to go and help him in the studios because the BBC were able to monitor the broadcasts of other crews in Romania, other foreign crews, and some of the material they were broadcasting had Romanian segments in it, in the Romanian language, and he wanted me to translate them for him. And then after the events in Timișoara on the 16th of December, he said, I'm leaving with a crew from London and we're going to Romania, but will you stay behind in my office? You can have my office, and I want you to be a sort of backup, to be an anchor for me. And that's how my experience of the revolution began. I was sitting in John Simpson's office, and I had 35 monitors in front of me with broadcasts from the Soviet Union, Libya, West Germany, the United States. And for me, it was marvelous. You know, you're a historian. It's like watching the French Revolution, 200 years ago, and you see it all on a screen in different towns. And these crews were in different towns in Romania. So they weren't all in Bucharest. Some were in Satu Mare, some were in Constanța, others. And I was just transfixed. Here was a revolution being visualized, or not just visualized, but actually witnessed by me in a way that very few other people could do it, could see it, could take advantage. And of course, that's what led me to become even more interested in trying to find out exactly what happened in the Romanian Revolution. And still today, we have a lot of lacunae, a lot of gaps regarding who did what and when. But one of the chapters of the book is devoted to my experience of the revolution firsthand, not firsthand, but secondhand, via the BBC. And then later, when after Ceausescu's execution on Christmas Day 1989, John then asked me to go out and join him in Romania. And I wrote at length about how I got to Romania with a second BBC crew to join the one that was already there. And how we had to travel via Poland, and then we flew to Bulgaria, and then we went by car from Bulgaria into Romania. And I arrived on the 31st of December in Bucharest, having made the journey from Bulgaria. And the whole journey from Bucharest, from Rusei, sorry, not from Bucharest, but to Bucharest, from Rusei on the Danube, there were people, because one of the cameramen, one of our BBC cameramen, had put Union Jacks on the hood of the cars that we're using, and there were people in villages all the route from Giurgiu, the town on the Danube, in Romania to Bucharest, and they were clapping. They were clapping as we went by, and it was very moving. You can imagine for us and for all of us there. And we got to Bucharest, and then we began filming there. And there were a number of experiences, again, which I recounted in the book, of shooting, sniping on the street, and how, for me, it was something completely out of the ordinary. I mean, I'm just a history professor, but to be shot at and so on, in a way, you're in a different world, and you don't worry about being shot, or at least I didn't, and John certainly didn't, because he'd been shot at in various places around the globe. So, but the whole atmosphere of working with a TV crew was very illuminating for me. And when we talk about the BBC today and filming, let's say in Afghanistan, or filming in the Gaza Strip or wherever it may be. And I read in the newspapers, and quite rightly, correspondents are praised for their bravery, but the cameramen are not. They're not mentioned. And remember, in order for a correspondent to be filmed, he has to be photographed. He has to have a cameraman standing in front of him. And very often the cameraman is exposed. He's standing up, whereas the correspondent is sitting down or hiding behind a wall or some edifice, some construction. But it's those very small things that leave or left a deep impression on me, and the fact that some people risk their lives very frequently in this way in order to bring the news. Anyway, after the events of the revolution, I went back again. The BBC asked me to go back to help them cover the elections of May 1990, the conduct of elections, which were far from perfect, but given the fact that Romanians hadn't experienced elections for more than 50 years or so, it's not surprising that they were not perfectly organized, and they were flawed, yes, but the authorities, I think, in the conditions of the time, did their best. And then subsequently, I observed elections in 92 and in 94, and then 98 and in 2000 and in 2004. I observed them this time on those occasions as part of national teams who were constituted by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and therefore we had accreditation from the Romanian government to go and film and go and monitor. And in the case of observers, I didn't film anything because you were asked not to film as an observer because you had official status. But nevertheless, for me, again, as a historian, an observer of Romania, it was invaluable to be able, with official permission, to go and speak to voters, to go and speak to the party representatives in each of the polling stations that we visited. It was, as I said, invaluable in order to form a picture of what were the issues that really motivated people and guided them in their choice of voting. And that was something that, of course, you were able to transmit later on to your students and to other people who had an interest in Romania. And I continued to build on those experiences and the officials whom I met down the years for my subsequent visits to Romania. Many of the Romanian students I taught, especially postgraduates, or I supervised under joint supervision in Romania. Several of them are ministers, have been ministers in Romania. One of them was even head of the Romanian intelligence service, a former student. I mean, you find this very difficult to believe, but it's again, it's a result of the hands-on society and the fact that you, as an outsider, in fact, treated very differently to an insider in Romania or someone who is a Romanian citizen. So people would talk to me, and they admitted to me, officials talked to me as a British citizen in a way they wouldn't talk to a Romanian reporter. And several Romanian journalists have said that to me down the years. And of course, that's helped me in my research, and it's helped my students because I pass on some of the information that I'm able to acquire to them. Finally, as I mentioned, I've just got back from Romania. This was before the present crisis regarding voting. And I have to say, I was very surprised with the outcome of the current presidential race. I mean, no one forecast this. What I can say is I've never had much faith in Romanian opinion polls. They're very often way off the mark when it comes to giving results for both presidential and parliamentary elections. And so the fact that there was someone like Elena Lasconi who appears to have gained second place in the election uh, didn't surprise me. What did surprise me very much was the head of the PSD, or Marcel Ciolacu, didn't get elected. I thought he would win, and I thought he would become president, quite honestly. So you can see that my forecast was rather off mark as well. But again, it's one of the difficulties of trying to follow events in a country where people have been used to dissimulating. And when people are interviewed, as I saw when I was there, as to what their political opinions were or how they were likely to vote, I'm sure they were speaking uh, not for the camera really, but they were speaking uh, for um, an audience which, or for the authorities, because they thought it would stand them well, irrespective of how the results turned out. So
Is it worth actually, sorry to interrupt you, to ask you the question, why do you think the polling is so way off? So from what you could observe throughout the years, what are the reasons why
well,
this
I
is
think you have
so
to have
different?
a margin of error in Romania has to be much larger than it would be in many Western countries because of dissimulation. People are afraid to express their true opinions because of the possible impact it might have. And so they, as I say, dissimulate. This is how people lived their lives in Romania in the communist period. There was one life, which was the public life, especially if you're a member of the Communist Party, and your private life, which was very different, and where even in your private life you didn't speak to children and express an opinion about Nicolae or Elena Ceausescu, because in certain schools the pupils were asked, what did your parents, what do they talk about at home? What TV programs did you watch? I mean, I'm referring to when I talk about TV programs pre 1984, because after 1984, TV broadcasts were restricted to 4 hours, of which 2 hours were generally devoted to Ceausescu's visits around the country and giving indicații prețioase,
Yep.
useful tips for workers in various industries and so on. So,
So I was privileged in that respect, because I had my grandma's trust. So I used to sit on the floor with her and we would both very quietly listen to Radio Free Europe and
yeah,
the American Voice, on other things than you would normally hear on the channels. But I absolutely identify with what you're saying about the dual life and the dual experience, and the face that you would show outside and the face that you would keep for the inside, and the fact that you would not have a conversation indoors, even in your own house, on a normal voice, because the walls had ears and your neighbors could report you. And
yes, and bear in mind, in apartment blocks, there was an administrator, an administrator, someone who kept the books, and he or she was obliged to note down visitors to the apartment block, that is, people who did not live there permanently. And then every fortnight, the local Securitate officer would check the registrations of people who came in. I
Sectoristul.
mean, I know this from because the Securitate officers so often happens in Romania. You get friendly with figures from the authorities, and then they confide in you. And I knew that they would monitor me. I was an outsider, but I was allowed because I was visiting my parents-in-law, so there was a justifiable reason for me to go and see them. But he still noted down in the book, and he was on open, and I accepted that. It was just a fact of life.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I
Andrew,
think I've probably spoken enough, and as I say, very open to questions that anyone has.
Thank you very much. I think Sorina and I would like to come in with some questions about recent events. Sorina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and the only request is that because we're still in an election period, ideally we would like to avoid names and parties, simply because the electoral whatever has closed now. So it would be
Yes.
not come across
And
as if we're kind of advertising either or.
yeah,
But other than that, not that you would, obviously. Other than that, I have a special interest in corruption and governance, and I'm really keen to hear your opinion because I didn't think it was as detailed in the book on the corruption then and now, and the lack of transparency then, and how that reflects in today's situation. But equally, one of the portion of history that we never really got to study at school, because Andrea and myself were the last generation that were more or less aware of what's going on. I was 11 at the revolution, and I think you were too. That 1965 period is something that we're still learning about. The people who were martyrs under the communists and who were essentially the extreme far rights, who were supporters of a different totalitarian regime, somehow became the victims, and it just completely messed with everyone's minds, I believe. So
I mean, when you use the word martyr, I assume because this is how the extreme right sees them.
yes,
But we have to bear in mind that these figures, first of all, for ideological reasons, like Romanian communist ideological reasons, these people were removed from the history book or written out of history, if you like. A bit of a there's some tautology there, obviously, but they were excluded from history. And what we find in 1990 after the revolution is the restoration to history of figures who were removed for political reasons. So in order to restore these figures of the extreme right to history, so there was a compensatory action, one might say. That is, people wanted to attribute qualities to them which had not been attributed for ideological reasons during the period of Romanian communism. So they overcompensated, is what I want to say. That is, historians began to overcompensate when they were trying to, what in their view, they were redressing the balance as to how we regard fascism and communism. The two are often placed alongside each other. So if you've had one side, if you like, of the coin that has been obscured for you, and you feel that that side of the coin should be exposed, should be discovered, then this is really what happened after 1990 and is now continues to happen to the present day, because we see candidates in some of the parties espousing the ideas of people from the Iron Guard from the 1930s. And these ideas were violent ideas in many cases, and the violence of the ideas led to the Holocaust. I mean, violent words often lead to violent deeds, and that's where you find, of course, in the murder of Jews and Gypsies, not just in Romania, but in other parts of Eastern Europe, and of course, especially in Nazi Germany, you find that they're driven by the ideology of hatred towards certain ethnic groups. And that is what is disturbing today in Romania, where you have politicians who actually are, as I say, supporting espousing these views of hate, of violence, because that's what it is. When you look back, if you admire someone from the Iron Guard, you don't just you don't just admire the person in isolation. You admire what they stand for and what they did. And that is why I think many young Romanians, I found 2 weeks ago, there were university students who came to my lectures, and in the Q&A afterwards were asking me, but Professor, tell us more about the Iron Guard. We don't understand it. Who are Cinis and Legionari? Why are they called legionnaires and so on? I mean, and this is a basic, if you like, weakness, a failure of the educational system in Romania, where still we're living under the influence of this dichotomy, whereby the lack of candidness or candor about the Iron Guard and the extreme right is reflected in the ignorance of many young people, not all, because there were several I met, of course, who were well aware. But that's what I'm afraid these are tropes that certain politicians today are exploiting in their electoral propaganda.
And what can you tell us about the opportunism versus an actual political doctrine, shall we say? So if I take the UK system as an example, or even the French system, if I speak to anybody, they will tell me I vote Labour because, and here's a list of things
Yes.
that really stand out for me. These are my values, etc.
Yeah.
If I speak to the Tories, it's the same thing, and in France it will be exactly the same thing. I don't know how you felt about, is that the case in Romania? Was that the case for Ceausescu? Was he really a true communist? Was Zelea Codranu a real, I don't know, far right, whatever he portrayed, legionary is Romanian word for it.
Well,
But
when
the
you
understanding
ask,
of the two don't seem to.
well, when you ask, was he a real fascist or was he a real communist? They both were in their cases. Yes, they believed in the ideology, and it was expressed in their writings. So both had a vision which they followed. I mean, Cornelius Elia Codreanu had a vision. By the way, there are extracts. If you look at Ceausescu, advocated the creation of the new man, except he called it the new socialist man. But Zelia Codreanu talked in the 1930s about the creation of the new man. He didn't say fascist new man, or at least I'm not aware that he did, but he did say new man. He used the same expression, the new man. And Ceausescu didn't seem to realize that the use of the term new man had these connotations, which were 100, totally opposed to the connotations that you would give to a true socialist or a true communist. Again, there's a very strong blurring of the difference between communism and socialism, communists and socialists. I mean, you find that in the United States today. I found that with my American students. They didn't really understand the difference between communism and socialism. But in Romania, again, you have to bear in mind that Ceausescu often spoke about the transition from socialism to communism. So it was a progression in his mind, or in some of his speeches at any rate. And that, again, isn't fully, I think, realized at the school level and at the university level. I'm not saying it should be taught, but at least as a general feature of understanding the ideology that drove certain political figures in the 30s and then again in the communist period, is very important. To take your question a little further, what is lacking today in Romania is no vision. I mean, if you look for what is the foreign policy of Party X, nothing. You know, it may be a phrase about we want to stay with the West or something, but but to have concrete details about what you stand, where do you stand? Where do you stand on the conflict in Gaza? Where do you stand on the problem of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Where do you stand on a whole number of programs of problems in the world? You don't find that, and it's not just within the Romanian government that you look in vain, but looking in the electoral material, you're looking for that sort of statement, and it's very difficult to find it. And ever since 1990, because I like to look at the programs of the parties, that is a very noticeable fault of the parties, that no vision and no ideas, or very few ideas. It's all these general terms about the Romanian people deserve better. Well, of course they deserve better, but because they've been failed by the political elite, that's the problem. And this is something that no party will recognize. And it's something that, as I say, you would expect to find in a Western democracy. Let me give you just one concrete example. Romanian MPs, very few of them actually meet their constituents.
That's right.
Very few. Some do, yes. But the idea of going back to your constituency and discussing the problem that the constituent has raised is alien to many Romanian members of parliament. I'm afraid that most of the Romanian political class, not all, again, I want to stress this, but many of them put their own personal interests above even the party interest, let alone the country's interest. And this is, I think, a fact that many young people are aware of, and explains the, in my view, misguided results of the first round of the elections. But there we are. You know, that's the product of a lack of transparency.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question which has us looking forward and backwards a little bit. You've already mentioned briefly the revolution of 1989. In a couple of weeks' time, we'll be celebrating about 35 years, 35th anniversary of the revolution. And I always, like Sorina, I was 11 when it happened. I witnessed some of it firsthand because it started in my home city, and we went out to see what was going on. We heard there was something afoot, and we went out to see what was going on. It was the first day of the school holidays. And I always sort of take this time to remember and reflect not only on those events, but also on what has happened since and where we are against what we were hoping for 35 years ago. How did you experience the revolution of 1989? And how do you now reflect on what happened then and what's happened since?
For me, the revolution started as a popular uprising in Timișoara, and I always, I'll very often tell my Romanian students, look, the train of the revolution started off in Timișoara, but en route to Bucharest, it got hijacked, and it got hijacked by a second echelon of communists. And the revolution, it was a revolution in my view, but it was taken over by figures from the Communist Party, who then swapped their Communist Party ID for the ID of the National Salvation Front. And so you had the same people around, but they were just carrying a different label around their necks. But there was a revolution, and we see that through, first of all, the fact that there were multi-party elections in May 1990. We see it in the fact that people were allowed to have a passport and travel abroad. So having a passport was a right. It wasn't a privilege as it had been before 1989. There was the admission of private property. Peasants were given back their land. It took a long process in many in many cases, and also there was the right to hold a foreign bank account. All of this had a radical impact on people. We then found, as a result of the revolution, yes, this was a long drawn out process, but it was long drawn out because the Communist Party remnants who were now in the National Salvation Front wanted to control change. So there was change, but it was on their terms. They wanted to have the money in order to buy up various enterprises which were no longer economically sound. They wanted money to invest and set up new companies. And so a whole new, we might say, in one sense, generation appeared after the revolution and took Romania's economy forward, but at a very, very slow pace. If we just have some figures around privatization in Romania between 1990 and 2000, Romania attracted 10 billion pounds in foreign investment between 1990 and 2000, the whole decade. Poland attracted 10 billion investment in 1 year in 2000. Just in 1 year, not counting the years between 1990. So it shows you the slow rate of privatization and investment in Romania. And of course, this is thankfully, Romania has made up quite a lot of ground since then. But it retarded really the development, the economic development of Romania in that period from 1990 really up until Romania's, first of all, entrance into NATO in 2004, and then its joining adherence to the European Union in 2007. And when you look back at the post-revolutionary period, you have to, I think, say that reform in Romania has really been more the work of the Euro-Atlantic structures, and by that I mean NATO and the European Union, but also the Council of Europe. More the work there and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's been the result of their insistence rather than the result of any major initiatives from Romanian political parties, because Romanian political parties want to control that investment. And if it's being sponsored by foreign companies through investment, then they're not getting control, they're losing control. And so you had this conflict, really, this tension between foreign investors who want to come in and the locally grown investors who appeared after 1990 in the development of Romania. That's, I don't know if I've answered satisfactorily your question, but there was a revolution. Yes, several of my Romanian students say, no, Professor, no, you're naive. There was no revolution. And I say, but look, look at the difference. I experienced the difference.
It definitely answers the question. Sorry, Nicola. I had the same when I was about 11, 12 years old. And I remember that I really wanted to ask somebody who would have a little bit more experience. And the luck made it that on my 13th birthday, I was traveling back from France, where I'd spent the summer with a family that received me as part of a cultural exchange. And on the same flight, right in front of me, sat Johan Ratiu. And I could not hold myself from just tapping on his shoulder and saying, I'm really, really sorry. I just want one answer from you, and I want you to tell me if it was true or did we all dream it.
Yeah.
So I have his answer written on a plain napkin,
Yeah.
and he said exactly what you said. So there we go.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's an amazing story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Um,
I was fortunate enough to meet Yonratsu many times. I'm still, of course, very much in close contact with his son and his sister-in-law, Pamela. And in fact, I was in Tourda visiting Pamela just about 3 weeks ago. So it's, as I say, someone who uh, deserves more recognition than he gets for his support of opposition in Romania during the communist period.
Thank you.
I think it's my turn now. I wondered if we could wind back. I really enjoyed reading the book, and you say very early on that your introduction to the subject of communism was at secondary school in Holloway, North London, and then this years later led to your enrollment as a student of Romanian at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at UCL. And you spoke already, and also it came up in the book, obviously, that your first direct contact with Romania took place in July 1965. My questions just disappeared there for a second. And you speak about this encounter with author Marin Preda on a train. But that it was only in January 1969, when you took up a scholarship awarded by the British Council, that you were able to travel within Romania unescorted. And so I wondered if we could reflect firstly on the fact that you say your search for Romania is a personal journey, your transition from your interest in language and literature to history and politics, and then also on the sort of variety of your friends that you made then and over the years of various backgrounds and ages. You say that they included creative writers, historians, engineers, doctors, farmers, party officials, students, pensioners, Hungarians, Saxons, and Jews, and that your friendship with them confirmed you and your distrust of generalizations about Romania, generalizations which continued to be made in some parts of the Western media about post-Ceausescu Romania, and which, if accepted, lead to flawed judgments. So, yeah, I wondered if we could reflect on those things.
Yes, I think regarding judgments, the situation has improved somewhat because, for the wrong reasons, in fact, because Romania gets into the news often for negative reasons and not enough, in my view, for positive ones. Of course, there are negative developments in Romania and they deserve to be studied, but also, again, we in the West have lived a privileged existence. If you, for example, I often made this comparison with my students in London. If you were an elderly lady born in 1919 in the north of Bukovina, and you lived until the beginning of this century, you would have had 6 different citizenships because northern Bukovina became part of Romania in 1919. Then for a while, parts of it became part of Ukraine. Then it was given back to the Soviet Union, or given to the Soviet Union in 1940. In 1941, it was reconquered by Romanians. In 1944, it was reconquered by the Red Army, and then after the war, given back to Romania. And in 1990, it became part of Ukraine again. And who knows what will happen to the war area given the present Russo-Ukrainian war. But that's an example of how we, or French people, or Americans even, have lived within a particular geographical area which has remained constant. Its boundaries have not changed. But for many people in Europe, nationality and citizenship, however we're going to define the two, have never been constant. And so their life is affected. If you're a lady, as I was saying, born in northern Bukovina, you might have been a native Romanian, you might have been a native Ukrainian, you might even have been a native Austro-Hungarian subject, but your mother tongue would not necessarily have been Romanian, which became the language of administration in 1919, 1920. So the lady in my example would have had to learn through at least 3 different languages and deal with the authorities in 3 different languages in the time frame that I mentioned. And that makes life difficult, especially if you're a peasant and you don't have much education. And those aspects of the uncertainty of life are not really, I think, given the importance that they deserve. Why did Romania and other countries in East Central Europe join NATO? Basically, because they wanted certainty. They wanted the certainty that they wouldn't be invaded by Russia. And in order to seal that certainty, they wanted to join the European Union, and they did, 2007. And so uncertainty in their life was removed. Of course, we can also argue, especially for people from the older generation who depended on the certainty of communist rule, that they dislike the multi-party system. They don't like having to make a choice. But that's, again, another aspect of the history of the region we're dealing with, and one which, or an aspect which deserves consideration when we're making judgments about the area as a whole. Why do people, I go back to my comment about dissimulation, why do people dissimulate? Because they don't have trust, because they're uncertain.
But was it something about Romania that made you, because your initial interests, as I understand them, were in language and literature, and then you became much more interested in
It
history?
was. It was for internal reasons within University College or the School of Slavonic Studies. So I was employed in order to teach Romanian chroniclers, the Moldovan chroniclers of the 17th and 18th century, because in SEAS, in the School of Slavonic East European Studies, we had very specialized courses. So I taught that, but then I also had a course on the history of the Romanian language up until 1984, when a professor who was one of my professors, Hugh Seaton Watson, a very celebrated historian of Russia in particular, but Eastern Europe, but he spoke very good Romanian. He'd been with his father, Robert Seaton Watson, to Romania in 1938-39, and he fell in love with the country. But as I say, his main specialization was Russia. But he taught some Romanian history at SEAS, at the school. However, when he retired, his replacement for Russian history didn't know Romanian. And so the college authorities, the director at the time, asked me, since I knew Romanian, would I teach some Romanian history? And that's how I started in 1984. So it was very fortunate for me, of course, because I began to read in Romanian, which not very many British historians were able to do. But I read Romanian books because we had an excellent library and still do have in London. But also when I went to Romania, I met Romanian historians and spoke to them in Romanian, which they appreciated very much. And you'll see that's how I got to know Șerban Papakostea, one of the figures I mentioned in the book, how I got to know him. It was by going to meet him at the Nicolae Iorga Institute of History in Bucharest. that we became friends. And then because he'd been a political prisoner in the early 1950s, I became interested in the secret police in Romania and the whole problem of victimization of democratic figures, Democrats in Romania. So it was if you like, a sort of natural progression to move into history, and then within history to move to the period of communism and to understand, to try to understand why people were arrested for their political views. And one has to add here, in the communist system, you weren't necessarily tried, you were just arrested. In 1954 and 52, when 2,000 students were sent from the University of Bucharest to the canal. This was a huge building project in the Danube Delta. None of them were tried. They were arrested because they were, inverted commas, intellectuals. And an intellectual is someone, if you're a communist, you need to be wary of. That's a quote from Khrushchev, by the way, but Khrushchev once said historians are dangerous people, they need to be controlled. Well, they are, and or they were. And so, as I say, that drove me to want to know more about this very dark period of Romanian history, that is communist repression, again at a time when in Romania you had to be very careful about addressing that topic or on talking even with someone about it. You would only do it if you knew them very well in a private location, because so many of Romania's pre-war intellectuals and politicians had been arrested and jailed, as I say, many of them without trial.
Would just disappear.
Or just disappeared, yeah.
Yeah, they would just go out.
Well, they disappeared because, for example, I mentioned the 2,000 students who went to the Danube Delta. A number of them died while they were cutting reeds, because they were sent there to cut reeds for a cellulose plant in the Black Sea. And the Guardians just buried them amongst the reeds in the waterlogged ground. And still today, I don't know whether recently a body's been found, but up to a few years ago, bodies would suddenly appear in those areas which were still being cultivated for reeds. So there was no notification given to the families as to what happened to these particular victims.
Serena, are you next?
I'm gonna go for your role as a conference and security cooperation in Europe. So you were observer in the 90s and the 19.
Yes, in the 90s, in Romania for various sets of elections, and then in the Republic of Moldova twice, in 94 and 98. And then in 2004, the Romanian government didn't ask for observers, but it asked for 12 monitors to monitor the participation of Romas or Gypsies in Romanian elections. And this was a subject that was of interest to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So that again was very fortunate for me, because I could go into Roma villages with the support of the Romanian government, but also with the support of the local Roma head, who's called a Bulibasha in
Bibasha, yes.
the Bulibasha. So I went to several villages on the eve of the elections to visit the Bulibasha and to talk to him. And this gave me an opportunity to discover how the Gypsies, the Romas, were doing economically. And what I discovered was there were very big differences in the status of Gypsies, even within the same county. So I went on the day of elections, a Sunday, to Târgoviște Day, and went out into the countryside. And in one village, and being a Sunday, people were dressed in their suits and their fine dresses, the gypsy ladies, but also the Christian ladies. It was a mixed village, and they came and voted. And then I went to the outskirts of the same village, and there were poor gypsies living in misery in these hovels, we would call them. And I asked the mayor, because it was the gypsies were very suspicious of me. I had official badges and so on from the OC, but they thought this was very sinister, and so they wouldn't talk to me. So when I went back to the village itself, as opposed to the sort of outskirts of the village, I asked the mayor why these particular gypsies were living in such in desperate circumstances, and he said that it's just that they, first of all, have no education, that they're very tribal in their ways, and that they refuse the help that's offered by the village to gypsies. And as I say, there were gypsies in the village who were totally different. I mean, they were painters, decorators, plumbers, craftsmen, and I was allowed to speak to them, and they spoke to me, and they saw I had accreditation, and I explained to them who I was and so on. So as I say, we're going back to this quote about generalizations. You know, you can generalize, as many people do, about the Roma and Gypsies, but you have to understand the fact that there are different types of Roma, just as there are different types of non-Roma. And you need to speak to as many types as you can before you try to come to some sort of assessment of their status.
Thank you. I was also angling for a comparison between voter and education and fraud between then and now, in your quality as an observer. You've talked already a little bit about education and the involvement of the Roma in the elections. Maybe we can expand on that a little bit.
Well, the Roma were, I wouldn't equate them with fraud in any way.
Yeah.
And what you have to bear in mind is that, and indeed the Bulevacha in Bolintinu din Vale, that was the village I went to just outside Bucharest, but he explained to me that people's votes were bought. And I said to him, one of the things that struck me was, although in the elections of 2004, there were 3 gypsy parties on the electoral roll, so they had candidates, but I found only one poster of propaganda for a gypsy party. And I asked them, why is that? And he smiled and he said, well, that's because the ruling party of the time pays us more to vote with them than the gypsy parties are able to pay us. I mean, that was his reply. And again, you have to go back to, I think, the interwar period, where you'll see, if you read the memoirs of Constantin Argeșanu, first of all, it strikes you the violence in elections, where National Peasant Party members became involved with in fights with members of other democratic parties. I'm not talking about just fights between Democratic Party members and the fascists, but this is amongst Democratic Party members. And the role that opportunism played in interwar politics. And in 1984, Anna Blandiana wrote an article for a cultural journal in Romania. And she was asked the question, what's the greatest blight on Romanian intellectuals today? And her answer was a single word: opportunism. 1984. And it's partly true today, partly. No, we find people switching political parties very frequently, that is, candidates for the parties switching their allegiance very quickly. The mayors, when I was working with the OSCE, I discovered that mayors some mayors had been in office for, say, 8 or 9 years, but representing three different parties, depending on the term of office. So they hadn't represented a particular party for 8 or 9 years. They'd represented three different parties in the course of those 8 or 9 years in that time span. So again, things from certain points of view have not changed that much.
Thank you.
I think it might be my turn. And also just to say, are you still okay for a couple more questions? Because I
Yeah,
know
yes,
you have to go at 7:30.
yeah.
7:20 now, so or just so I wondered if we might talk a bit more about access to and memorialization of historical events in terms of what you were saying about the fact that many students you've encountered have not, had access to information about history from the 30s and 40s, and your involvement in the Siget Memorial Museum, and that you were invited to become a part of by Anna Blondiana, who you just mentioned, which is not just a museum but also a research center, and your role in founding and membership of the board of the Romanian Institute of Recent History, which is now known as the Institute for the Study of Communist Crimes in Romania. And then also one last thing, reflecting on your Securitate file, which you were able to consult in 2006. So yeah, sort of reflection on those three things in terms of access to and the remembering of history, recent history.
Yeah, the memorialization of the past, this encounters difficulties at present, because the history curriculum in secondary schools, so before we get to university level, but even in secondary schools, is restricted to 1 hour a week. So think of it in the case of 16-year-olds, so they have a general course about Romanian history in particular, and several textbooks which they can consult, which are approved by the Romanian Ministry of Education, but there are also ones which are independent, what they call independent textbooks, which are not approved, but that doesn't mean to say they're not academically suitable. So with the reduction in the number of hours which are dedicated to the teaching of Romania in schools, you can see that this really exaggerates or exacerbates the problem there is regarding knowledge of the past at the general school level, even, as I say, even if we're not looking at students who go on to study history at university, but they probably go on to do other things. But in their general education, their exposure to Romanian history at the secondary school level has been reduced in recent years. And this is a problem for Romanian school teachers, especially those who teach history in secondary schools. Now, the effects of this, of course, is on, generally speaking, we might say the quality of knowledge that some history students have when they enter a history department in the university. It depends very much on the university. Again, I don't want to generalize about it, but it's a problem of the access to the study of the past, and then coupled with that, the very significant development of the use of the internet in recent years, because many people, many students, and this is true in university life in the UK to a certain degree, they simply copy material out of Wikipedia and present it as essays. So in Romania, and I've experienced this in the UK and the United States, because I taught there in both places for a number of years. That people, students are sometimes quite dim. They don't realize that history teachers actually do read history books, and they can tell. I mean, one colleague of mine discovered or had an essay which quoted from her own books but didn't mention her name. Of course, she recognized the essay and gave the student 0. But it shows you the influence that access to the internet has had. It can be very positive, certainly, because people who use it wisely can compare different sources. But there are others who are less wise and perhaps more lazy, who just copy en bloc what is on the internet. And I'm afraid in societies that are not, we might say, not inquisitive enough, we find that they take the simple option of just choosing a particular view, which is very often a conspiracy theory, and adopt it as their own without challenging legitimacy of the information. And this has become a problem because in order to disprove conspiracy theories, you have to urge the student to produce credible information, credible proof. So if we go back to election propaganda today, where's the credible proof that one country is intervening in the affairs of another? And very often you can't find any credible proof. It's just a conspiracy theory. It must be the case because the country concerned has done it in the past. Well, that's an argument that really doesn't hold any water if you are looking to examine sources and, as I say, examine material on the basis of its credibility. So I was asked my students to ask themselves, what is the difference between what you know, and what you believe? What's the difference? And if they can't give you a convincing answer, then you can take them further and you start questioning sources.
But you don't think these institutions, like the ones I mentioned, the Sigurd Memorial and the Institute for the Study of Communist Crimes in Romania, they have much influence in terms of
They have some
educating
influence, and indeed that's why they were set up. Partly partly in the case of the Institute for Recent History, that was set up with money from the Dutch government originally, but then it was amalgamated with the Institute for Investigating Crimes of Communism and is now supported by the Romanian government. The same is true of the Sighet Memorial. That's supported partly by donations, but originally we could say seed money was the European Union in its form at the time in 1993. These provide very important sources, alternative sources of history. And in fact, the book Anna Blandiana and her husband, Romulus Rusan, who sadly died a couple of years ago, but they asked me to write this book about, a very small book about communism in Romania, which is a bestseller. And it's gone through 5 editions and an edition in English, because the Minister of Education back in the mid-90s saw the Romanian version and he asked for it to be translated into English. Well, there was no need to translate because I'd written it originally in English. But he asked my permission to publish it in Romania, and it went to 10,000 schools free of charge, the English language volume about communism in Romania. The Romanian edition, which was in fact the first edition, because my original English manuscript was translated into Romanian and published by Sighet Memorial Foundation, that, as I say, went through 5 editions. And people still today, even in my last book tour, 1 or 2 students came up to me with copies of the book in Romanian from 10 years ago because they wanted my autograph on it. So it does have an impact. And there are, so as I said, the book sold very well. It made some money for the foundation, which I was very pleased happened. And also the Minister of Education in 1996, I think it was, he was very pleased that the book got out because he was a fervent anti-communist and he wanted a study about the impact of communism in Romania to reach schools, because it was distributed, as I say, in 10,000 copies to secondary schools.
Mm.
I can definitely echo your experience from my own experience on history lessons. So we did anything that you want to talk about in terms of history of Europe, prehistory, whatever, Romans, and other empires of the world. And when we got to the 1930s, I just remember all of my history teachers, be that in secondary school or in high school, saying, there's nothing that I can teach you from the history books because they've been rewritten and whatever is saying in them is rubbish. So we can do something else if you want to, but there's nothing that I can talk you through right now. So I feel that I had to recover that lack of information by myself through my own research, and I think in my situation there are many. And then talking to other people, I think what you're trying to get to is the lack of critical thinking in education and the lack of understanding and being able to make the difference between, like you said, what's an opinion and what's a fact.
Yes, that's very true. And the lack of critical thinking is something that's commented on in reports of the European Union about teaching in Romania. And you see that also in submissions, because very often I'm asked to be a referee for journals, especially history journals, relating to articles on Romania. And several of them, I mean, a number of them are excellent articles, and I sort of tick the box and give them a go ahead, in my view. But there are others which are completely lacking in any analysis, critical thinking, and are merely a sort of catalogue of events. Rather like a chronograph, as we would call it, just a list of events without any real explanation of the significance of those events. And that again, I would say, is not a problem that's reserved just for Romania. It happens in other schools in other countries where I've taught. And of course, you try to address that. That's why you're there as a teacher, to encourage your students to engage in critical thought and to interrogate the past. That's a phrase I often use. You have to interrogate the past.
I think we're kind of drawing to an end, Andra.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much. And you're
Okay.
about to get an insight into the inside joke that we mentioned earlier before we went live. So this is the question that we ask all of the authors, and for some of them is the most difficult question of the evening. And it usually comes to me, so I now just take it by default just because it's fun.
Okay.
Obviously, this is a project to discover and rediscover books by Romanians or about Romania. And it's a book recommendation project with a weekly book to read. If you were to recommend us a book or a few books for the project to read, what would they be?
Well, do they have to relate to Romania or in
Yes,
general?
please. Yes. Yeah.
So specifically about Romania, you're
Yeah.
interested in. I would say, I mean, it's a long read, but it's available in Romanian, and that's Keith Hitchens' History of Romania, which is in 2 volumes. The first one covers 1776 or 1775, I think it is, down to 1880. I think I've got the dates right. And then the second volume, which is more voluminous, goes from the 1880s. I got it around here somewhere, if I can find it. It's 1866 to 1947 is the second volume, and they've been translated, published by Humanitas, and they're still, in my view, the best history of Romania, even though Keith, who was a friend of mine, he passed away a few years ago, but even though he didn't have access to a lot of material, he had to write the book on the basis of materials that were published in the communist period in Romania. But he included materials that he found before 1945. But it's a really excellent synthesis, I would say, of Romanian history. Another book that I would recommend is by Henry Roberts. Very difficult to get hold of, but he was a professor of history at Yale. Romania, Problems of an Agrarian State, published in 1952. And that is, again, is based on a man who spent some of the war years in Romania during the war because he worked for the OSS, the American office. Really, it was Secret Service part, which a forerunner of the CIA. But he was based in Romania from September 1944 and witnessed many of the events until 1946 when he left for the United States. But he witnessed several of the events that he described, and he writes extremely elegantly. And his chapters on the condition of the peasantry in the 1930s, they're unequaled. I haven't read anything, either in Romanian or in English, that equals what Henry Roberts wrote so many years ago.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, good.
I
Good to
can't
talk to
believe
you.
this is the penultimate live broadcast of the year. We have one more event coming up.
Good. Well, you'll keep me in touch, won't you? You've got my email address and so on.
Well, I have
Yeah.
lots more questions, but I'll save those for another time.
Okay, yeah.
Totally.
Did
All right.
you want to mention the last event?
No, you go ahead, Andrew.
No, it's okay.
Please do.
What is the last event?
So
No,
it's
sorry, I was just trying to do an intro to the last item.
So the next one is Thomas Gallagher.
Oh, Tom, yeah, I know Tom. Yeah.
So it's another insight and kind of seeing Romania through someone else's eyes
Yes. Yeah.
as a good way of kind of not necessarily celebrating, but not necessarily commemorating kind of a best of both worlds, and with an interesting political context on top.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah,
think
well,
Tom will have
Tom's a very good analyst, so
yeah.
he'll be a valuable contributor.
that's on the 13th of December, if you're free.
Yeah, I'm not sure because I'm giving a talk myself about the Romanian Revolution to some part of the Romanian diaspora that lives in East London,
Okay.
Bromley. So they have an event, and they asked me to go and talk about the revolution as part eyewitness anyway, and they have a whole day dedicated to it.
Okay. Is that
There's
also on the 13th?
there's also an event on the same day, organised by the Romanian Cultural Centre in London on the 13th of December. That's
Well, we've got competition then.
yeah.
Oh, we'll put the links in the chat. On the page for everyone to be able to see those.
Yeah, the ICR, they've got an event relating to the revolution on the 13th of December from 7 to 9:30.
I see.
I'm sorry, the event about the revolution, that's the following day, the 14th. So
Which group is that with?
that's with it's a young Romanian film director who's brought over two Romanian directors who've done documentaries about the Romanian Revolution, and he asked me to preface them. And in the East London Arts and Music Centre, it's called, which is in Bromley somewhere. I have to go to Bromley Bifo Underground Station. I've got to look up the details, but he asked me if I would go and talk, and I said yes.
Sounds fabulous.
Mm.
Wish we could make it, but I'm gonna be traveling in an opposite direction at that time, unfortunately.
Good.
Thank you again for all your
Okay.
time and your patience with our many and varied questions. Congratulations again to Nicola on her extensive research, and looking forward to all of you rejoining us in a month's time. Well, 2 weeks' time, almost. And in the meantime, have a lovely Friday evening and a lovely weekend. And don't forget to go and vote, please.
Yes, and yes, yeah, and enjoy the holidays. Enjoy the holiday season.
Indeed. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much,
Good night.
Dennis. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.